First, apologies for being very late. We got very lost in AUB. We had no idea how big this campus is. So excuse us for that. Thank you so much for coming today on our second day of the conference here at AUB. The first day was incredibly amazing for us and very interesting. All the panelists offered incredibly thoughtful insights of the work they're doing, the challenges they're facing, and their perspectives of the way forward in Syria. And on our second day, I think it's going to get more interesting and / controversial and exciting for us as researchers and practitioners. So we look forward to today's panels. And thank you so much for coming. And yeah, we're happy to have you here. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. Actually, I wouldn't take any more time actually from the distinguished panel. We will start with first panel today about the local reconciliation agreement and demographic change in Syria. I am happy to welcome to my distinguished panel the first one, Dr. Sami Al-Khiyami. He's a well-known diplomatic and former Syrian ambassador in London, and Dr. Agnes Fever from Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies, and Ms. Emma Peels, investigative journalist and predictor with focus in Syrian case. So, Dr. Sami, you can start.
Thank you very much. I'm not used to such a massive attendance. Thank you for coming.
Is the mic working?
I'm going to speak about economic decentralization, a necessary tool to enhance national and local reconciliation. So we're going to talk a little bit aside rather than inside the subject. The background being that local reconciliation after years of conflict and mutual animosity is a very complicated process. There is no doubt that reconciliation is multifaceted, involving several measures. I'm going to start with a side idea. In a society divided by various dissensions following a horrific conflict, the dissensions being ethnic majority versus ethnic minority, city versus countryside, all kinds of soi-disant animosities we have after the conflict, city versus countryside, non-tribal versus tribal, religious majority versus religious minorities, etc. There is an obvious need to achieve compromise around an exemplary role model, a virtual Syrian individual, Suri Namuzaji, incarnating the Syrian way of life, combining in himself what most Syrians consider as embedded qualities in their social and work behavior. Kindness, when you ask about Syrians, especially now that they are leaving the country and working in foreign countries, in particular the countries around Syria, you hear about many of the qualities they have. So let's try to combine these qualities in a virtual Syrian. Kindness, smartness, generosity, entrepreneurship, hardworking, not necessarily predisposed to teamwork, by the way, appreciation of good cuisine, of course, pride, sometimes masked with false modesty. This kind of role model is important. It may be beneficial in reuniting the Syrian society because the Syrians see a little bit what they seek to become or what they seek to resemble a virtual Syrian of high quality. The second point I want to raise is for local reconciliation and national reconciliation is minimal accountability, because you just cannot make accountability a prime subject. You may help dividing the society even more. So we have to go through a transitional reconciliatory justice, limiting its scope to crimes against humanity and acts of intentional killing. Another point is drastic change in the school educational system to teach people how to appreciate teamwork, better indulgent understanding of the religion, citizenship notion, entrepreneurship, rule of law, importance of human dignity. After 50 years of mukhabarat, even more, 60, 65 years of mukhabarat, we have to reteach people how to understand the importance of human dignity. Reduction of the duration of the military service, an equitable distribution of resources to provide all basic services and essentials to remote areas as well as to areas neighboring the cities. Serious efforts to organize meetings between social representatives, particularly in war-affected zones, along with common space discussions of short-term nature, how to revive successful initiative of the pre-conflict time, and short, medium, and long-term gender issues, citizenship, teamwork, mutual dialogue in order to reach a better understanding of one another, and long-term initiative that may bring more prosperity in domains that are not conflicting with the social traditions and way of life. Another point is enhancing the authority of local councils to take economic, cultural, and administrative decisions. And then a point important is put a halt to any demographic coercive movement of population that we are hearing of sometimes. But above all, and this is what I want to direct your attention to, is the achievement of a sustainable reconciliation is certainly based on the advent of prosperity and well-being. Therefore, on decentralized and fair economic policies. This is why I would like to finish my talk by talking a little bit about decentralized economy. The nature of the economic decentralization is a combination of administrative and economic decentralization, allowing local authorities to manage the investment programs and provide the means to attract investments. This system of local governance will not interfere with the management of national natural resources and with the provision of services which have a national nature and which remain in the hands of the central authority. This system still allows local service providers to sell their services to the central authority. What are the advantages of economic decentralization? Local investments remain closely linked to the social context. The available skills and the natural resources of the region in question. The relative resulting wealth creates a social entity that will seek to protect its achievement. When people become wealthier, happier, then they seek to protect their achievements, thus becoming gradually impermeable to any sort of terrorism. The regional economic successes can stabilize the local working force and limit the exodus to big cities. It may even create job opportunities for candidates from other regions. More flexible provision of local services like solar energy plants, water pumping stations, telecom, local data providers, serving the region and feeding the national network. The decentralization, especially the economic one, requires prerequisites: an elected local council with full authority over investment projects, local law and order authority. The police, local police had to be there. Local economic and trade judiciary. A pool of local engineers, a pool of consultants, surveyors, and a pool of auditors. Otherwise, you cannot have feasible project implementation. Then, one point that few people are thinking of, re-establish the local bourgeoisie, providing it with the necessary regulations to enable it to participate in the generation of wealth. What are the obstacles that we will face in proposing economic decentralization? We have, in many, many places in Syria, a limited number of competencies, especially with all those people who went to the big cities, and skilled labor. Gradual implementation may be the way forward if it is coupled with good intentions from the central authority. Another obstacle is initial planning should include offering higher salaries to some needed positions. Two additional factors should encourage skilled individuals to join: the relatively lower cost of living in remote areas, and the tendency of those originating from the same region to come back home. The heavy administrative load is another obstacle caused by decentralization. Penchant, inclination to undertake repetitive investment, like the shawarma you see everywhere, lahm bajin, everybody opens the same kind of shop. And this we will face in economic decentralization, only limited by competition. And then, of course, the resistance to change encountered in the ranks of the central authority, accustomed to take or at least certify all of the important decisions. These are basically the points I wanted to talk about, to raise a subject that is rarely raised, which is the economic decentralization in Syria, which may be the solution of most of the Levant or all of the Levant countries. People need economic decentralization. People need to feel that they are in their country, that they own their country. The sense of ownership is not there. We have realized during the Syrian war that the sense of ownership is very weak in the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. Now, Dr. Agnes Faber.
Agnès Favier. No, it's okay. Thank you. I will thank Dr. Hassan Abbas from Asfari Institute and Darin from London School of Economics to invite me and to have the opportunity to present today the finding of research we made with some Syrian colleagues between November 2016 and March 2017 on the so-called local reconciliation agreements. This research is published in both Arabic and English. It focused on 12 localities in Rif Damascus and El Wah in Homs Governorate. Since we have updated some information on the situation in these post-agreement areas until December 2017, and we've done some interviews regarding the situation in the Ruta and North Homs, but not enough to present a new analysis. So in this research, we define the local reconciliation agreements by their outcome. I mean, agreements which end an active conflict in given localities by means of disarmament of opposition forces and re-establishment of governmental allied forces, military control over the locality. Agreements which led to the displacement of some categories of population and the removal of all opposition or rebel governance structures at the local level. I will develop today 3 main points. A reminder of what is the negotiation processes and the actor involved in this negotiation in order to question the terminology used by to describe these local deals. Second, about the displacement induced by these local agreements, to question the concept of demographic change. And third, what means the return of the state according to the official terminology in these areas. So about on negotiating process and actors, first, local agreements since 2016 are in fact the culmination of conflict dynamics since 2012, dynamics that have been marked by a long period of both military intervention, escalation, and talks between representative of the regime and representative of local community in opposition areas. Some of these talks had resulted in temporary truce or ceasefires. But the Russian intervention in September 2015 was a real turning point that pushed opposition armed groups to negotiate evacuation deals with the regime. Before 2015, with the exception of the city of Homs, negotiations had aimed at reaching ceasefires or truce and even negotiation for swaps of detainees and bodies. But after 2015, negotiations focused on disarmament and surrender of local armed opposition forces and evacuations of population. And the first example of this final agreement was Daraya in August 2016. So in the majority of the case studies in Rif Damascus and Homs Governorate, the conclusion of these final agreements has been the result of negotiations held in the context of full-scale military offensive led by the regime, including, as you know, siege tactics, starvation, bombardment on civilian homes and service provision centers, but also use of more sophisticated tactics such exploiting rivalries between adjacent locality or infiltration and exploiting rivalries between armed groups in the same locality. In many cases, the conditions of the regime have been imposed, whereas those of local communities relating to the release of detainees and guarantees for the return of IDPs have almost always been ignored. So the first conclusion is for most of the people from these areas, these types of agreements represent more than an imposed solution than an agreement. Second, the reconciliation agreement, it's a term, this term is used mostly by the regime-affiliated media and representative following the establishment of the Ministry of Reconciliation in 2012, and then by the Russians that opened the Russian Center for Reconciliation at the Amamein air base in Latakia early 2016. Until now, no of these local agreements succeeded to initiate a process of reconciliation in the traditional sense of the word, and we identify at least 3 main grievances that represent and will represent important obstacle for a reconciliation process in these areas, but also beyond these areas. First is the compulsory conscription for men of national military service age, and the constant threat to be arrested for everyone. The second is the fate of thousands of detainees and missing people. And third, it's the potential seizure of property and real estate. And of course, there is a lack of transitional justice mechanism at the local level during this deals. So rather than offering any form of reconciliation, these agreements are more a coercive tool used by the Syrian government to retake communities that have fallen outside its control. If we talk about the actors of the negotiation, we could see that these agreements have a deeply security dimension. Security and military actors have been dominant in local negotiation as the main negotiators or decision maker, guarantor or mediator. On the side of the regime and its allies, we have at least 3 stakeholders, sometimes leading parallel negotiating process: the regime itself, and those who did the Ministry of National Reconciliation's operations on the ground are in general in the Republican Guard or security agency members. But we have also governors and also Sunni religious clerics, as the Mufti of Damascus and Rif Damascus. Prior to 2015, the negotiation directly between the regime representatives appointed by the regime and committee on the belief of the population were the norm. Thank you. The second stakeholder is the Russian himself. They are operating under the Ministry of Defense of Russia, and they opened Center for Reconciliation in many governorates since the beginning of 2016. Russian generals and their staff have acted as guarantors at first, but also as a primary intermediary and negotiator, in particular in El-Wah, today in North Homs and Bilruta. And the third is the Iranian through their local proxies. They are also active in so-called reconciliation agreements. For example, in Deir ez-Zor, they are very, very active. We can come back in the discussion. On the side of the opposition, or local communities, armed factions have played the most prominent role in many negotiations, especially in the last one. El-Ghouta, for example, we talked yesterday, but marginalization, total marginalization of the voice of the civilian during the last negotiation. We have also the local council, but the role of the local council often where local council were close to armed groups. And we have also in ad hoc reconciliation committees or negotiation committees, especially before 2016. There were also town notables and big family members of those who had formerly worked as regime intermediaries in the locality. So local agreements have a security dimension, but also a demographic one, and it's my second point about evacuation and demographic change. Evacuation has been one of the main clauses of these agreements, alongside with 2 other security measures. These 2 security measures are surrender of armed opposition heavy weapons, and second, settle the status of military ajmels. About displacement, we had we have two types of scenarios, either complete eviction of the enclave's original population, all the Homs, Daraya, Zabadani, Ain el-Fije, Kabun, for example. But in the majority of the other cases, it's a partial expulsion. In both scenarios, the implementation of these agreements has resulted in forced displacement. We have primarily targeting the local military and civilian leaders associated with the revolution against the regime. I mean fighters and their families, civilian leaders who are active in humanitarian organizations or civil society organizations, and local council. For reminder, you know, but for reminder, local civil council and organization had always been perceived as a threat for the regime for two main reasons. First, they were acting, or they were attempting to act as alternatives to state institutions, and second, and perhaps more important for the regime, they were received foreign support. These agreements contribute, of course, to demographic change, but they are not the only means used by the regime, since most of the displacement took place before these agreements due to the severe humanitarian situation and security situation in these areas. The question is, because all wars produce demographic changes, the question is whether these demographic changes are the result of systematic policies and for what purpose. And here, the concept of demographic change may be controversial. In Syria, is often used to claim that the regime, the Syrian government and its allies follow a policy to engineer a new sectarian balance. I mean, to reduce the proportion of Sunni and repopulate majority Sunni areas with foreign native Shiites. And the fact that the Assad regime may be using local agreements to implement a pre-planned demographic shift may be true in some sensitive and strategic areas, such as in some districts of Homs, but it's difficult, I think, to talk about a systematic politic on the national scale until now. If we come back to the local agreement, we lack evidences of the establishment of people from other ethnic and religious groups in these predominantly Sunni Arab areas. I would say, and it could be a subject for the discussion, but I would say that the regime follows a strategy to eliminate hostile local communities or hostile constituencies, which have been in the majority from Sunni popular backgrounds in impoverished rural areas and mid-sized towns, in addition to the suburb of Damascus and Aleppo. So for me, it's at the same time a social, sectarian, and class engineering. In other words, my assumption is that the regime does not discriminate against people based on sectarian or ethnic affiliation per se, but rather based on loyalty or hostility to the regime. So except the localities that witness total evacuation, the fact that the regime discriminates against people based on their loyalties is clear in the terms and implementation of the deal. Terms of the deal theoretically offer residents a choice about whether to stay or leave. But in general, people have to reconcile the status with the state. It means going through a security check and military conscription for miles, signing a document confessing to be part of the rebellion, and sometimes publicly clear criticism of the opposition, and so on and so on. So in the 2 minutes I have, I just want to talk about the return of the government of Syria in these areas. It's clear that through this local agreement, the main objective of the regime is to claim its return. But about what return we talk? About at a security and military level only, at an administrative and service provision level, or also at a political level. It's obvious that the regime will face significant challenges at these 3 levels. These reconciled areas are still gray zones, and the regime seems in the front of a paradox between its willingness to continue a policy of collective punishment against rebel areas, and its need for manpower, but also its quest for regaining legitimacy. And this search for legitimacy should go through even a limited return of population. So I don't want to develop this part, but I just want to conclude on on the fact that reconciliation has already morphed into a one and only return plan for the regime that will imply some deals with groups of IDPs and refugees. It's unclear whether and when it will encourage the return of certain categories of population, how many in which localities and for what results. But he has already started thinking to work to rebuild some network of its local intermediaries in these areas and to establish new one. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we have maybe from 10 to 15 minutes, sorry for that. Just after that, we will have like half an hour for questions.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about the reconciliations, obviously, but a little about the framework that they sit in, that they sit within, and about international involvement in that process during and after reconciliations. We've obviously heard a bit about what actual reconciliation might look like in the traditional sense of the word, so it's important to note that when I'm referring to reconciliation here, I'm using the term loosely as a kind of shorthand for an established and collectively understood process that has taken place across the country. Same with evacuations, we're generally referring to forcible displacement when we say that, and those semantic issues are important, but just to say that in this context, I'm using those words as a collectively understood phrase, not because I necessarily agree with the definition as it stands, but so that we all know what I'm talking about. And I think it's important to talk a little bit about what is happening in these areas after this reconciliation, because I think that some of the involvement and some of what's happening during this process and after this process is undermining that genuine reconciliation and stabilization and transitional justice and social cohesion, which you would hope to see moving forward. But it's a picture of where we are now, so that we can better understand where things might need to go from. So the umbrella is that we need to see the reconciliations in context, and I think that that's broadly been sort of poorly contextualized. So these areas have been besieged to some extent since very early on, 2012, 13, 14, and have been subject to a series of local truces, which were used in a carrot and stick fashion to allow services or to reduce or increase access restrictions in lines with obedience of the area or in line with sort of broader political objectives at the time. These local truces were seized upon by the international community and external actors as a positive step and something that could be tied into a decentralized, localized, administrative sort of agenda more broadly, including opposition local councils, and also into ceasefires and more general reduction in violence. And then from the government's point of view, they kind of allowed a sort of placeholder in some of these areas to sort of hit pause and come back to those areas when they were ready to address them in the way that we've seen them do so. And then after the reconciliations, the final reconciliations began in August of 2016. A few months later, the de-escalation process and policy was implemented on top of the sieges and reconciliations and local truces. And so that was an internationally sanctioned process that was sort of agreed upon in Astana, but had the involvement of other members of the international community. And there was a belief by many, I think, that de-escalation sat quite apart from reconciliations and was a solution or some new and different and better way to address this problem, when what we're seeing now is what we those of us sort of watching, I think, closely had sort of flagged as this was essentially becoming a legitimized version of this policy. And we've seen that in Ghouta, we've seen that in northern rural homes, and there are still 2 de-escalation areas remaining where we will probably see a similar kind of trajectory as the other reconciled areas across Syria. So while the international community, I use that term sort of very broadly, has taken a dim view of the reconciliations when they've happened, of the military campaign associated with them, of the forced displacements, they've also refused to act as guarantors or observers, or and so we've both got tangled up in this process in a way, but also been arm's length about actually remedying or intervening in a way that would perhaps ameliorate some of the bigger problems with this process in terms of, individual people's situation. And the international community has also had a role to play in accessing these areas to provide humanitarian aid during sieges, during reconciliations, and after reconciliations, and that is going to have an impact. Certainly the way that they're interacting with them post-reconciliation is going to have an impact as well. So by way of a snapshot, just over 2 years ago, seems like 2 minutes, but there were 50 communities under siege, 47 communities besieged by the government of Syria in Damascus, Rif Damascus, Homs, Rif Homs, and 2 by armed opposition in Idlib, and 1 by ISIS, Deir ez-Zor. And these areas were being accessed only through convoys and cross-border interventions and through sort of war economy workarounds. Those sieges have then been broken through reconciliation agreements, which have been brokered by the government and Russian actors, local armed opposition groups, reconciliation committees, and began to be sort of implemented in the final sense in Traya in August 2016, and most recently in the semi-complete northern rural Homs area, so Hawla, Talbisa, which have been in the process of final negotiations and are said to be evacuating an unknown number of people in the coming days. In each area, there's been a pattern of parallel between negotiations and tightened siege and military campaign to encourage those negotiations and to also try to ensure that the population encourage the local actors who are negotiating that they would quite like that negotiation to proceed because the last hospital no longer works or everybody is hungry. There are the agreements vary per locality, but there are some commonalities. The armed opposition is to leave or to reconcile their status with the government. There's an evacuation of fighters and their families, and those with security concerns, which often includes doctors, aid workers, civil society, media workers, people who are concerned about their security should they come back under the control of the government of Syria. The area then returns to the government's control, and access improves to some extent in terms of people being able to leave, come and go from the area, and goods being able to come and go from the area, but that varies. Most areas have negotiated a 6-month delay in conscription of local men, and then when this expires, there's been a varied response to that. So in Al-Tal, there has been a sort of ongoing arrest, sort of here and there, of men of fighting age for conscription. There's been a varied approach to the issue of detainees, and many areas included local detainees as part of their negotiation. In Wire, for example, there was a list of 7,500 local detainees, and that became a sticking point in implementation of the reconciliation. And we saw tit-for-tat releases between the government and Jaish al-Islam in Duma. In some areas, there are mandatory evacuee lists, and in others, there are not. Originally, in northern rural Homs, there was a mandatory list of 1,000 people for evacuation, which did include civil society, and there is no longer in that area, as I understand it. there's well over 100,000 people have been displaced from all of these areas, mostly to Idlib. And then what happens after the reconciliations, there's kind of these two types, typologies, which we just heard about. Some are sort of full evacuations and some are partial. And this status kind of plays into the prognosis of the area. Somewhat counterintuitively, the areas that are have a more severe reconciliation process and a larger evacuation actually do better post-reconciliation because the government has a blank slate from which to work and encourages the international community, aid agencies, etc., to come in and start doing rehabilitation works because they know that they have a greater degree of control over who will be able to return to that area. Others, like Madaya, are in a holding pattern. They're still essentially besieged. Limited aid can get in, limited rehabilitation. And some are kind of in this weird in-between phase because they were seen to be compliant in some way, such as Tal and Muadimiye, who are receiving a reasonable amount of support while still being, to some extent, restricted. Oh, 2 minutes, okay. The real reconciliation and stabilization is not occurring in these communities, particularly when you look at between these communities and neighboring communities, which will be the big test over time. Return is restricted by permission only, and then international support is offered on terms that the government allows, and very quickly, the way that we see that playing out in Aleppo, for example, is that in eastern Aleppo, which was very heavily barrel bombed, huge displacement, not just through the siege, but prior to the siege, has then had the NGOs and international agencies that wish to work there have been dictated to as to where they can work and been asked to prioritize areas on the basis of government priority areas and asked to not take part in works in areas where there would be an intent to redevelop those areas over time. And then there's a whole big HLP issue with regard to how people may or may not be able to return to their properties in those areas that are not priority areas or that are scheduled for redevelopment. So in that sense, I do agree that the displacements are occurring mostly along sort of support political, economic lines rather than explicitly sectarian in nature. And I will ignore the last 5 pages and go to questions.
Thank you, Emma. And thank you for the panelists for this valuable, really, presentations. Saving the time, I will quickly take the first set of questions. So anyone have questions? Let's Basil and yep. Okay.
Should I ask in English or in Arabic?
Yeah.
Well, can I go?
As you like.
So I just wanted to clarify first to Agnes and Emma. It's nice how Emma actually basically concluded her intervention by the question and clarification I wanted to ask Agnes about, which is about the evictions and how it is really related to ethnic backgrounds, or is it simply because certain ethnicities is somehow linked to loyalty, it is happening this way, or loyalty or opposition. So I work for the United Nations, and it is obvious that we don't have any empirical data to justify or to prove and to consider that there is a certain demographic changes in the country based on ethnic motives. I mean, we have plenty of anecdotes, plenty of stories, but no formal data. We were trying to seek this data from different places. So it is interesting, the remark Agnes has just put forward, that it's actually a very good angle to look at things, maybe. Maybe it appears that it is ethnically motivated re-engineering or demographic shift, because it so happens so that a certain ethnicity is so much sheer number in sheer proportion is so much pro or against the. So I like this angle, and probably it worth being explored further. The questions I have, and actually these are the questions to Dr. Sami, because he's our mentor somehow, and I'm very much interested to hear his thoughts about the decentralization. I always was interested to hear his thoughts about decentralization and how we do it. Well, the elements that Dr. Sami went through very fast as express measures to introduce decentralization are each a title of a huge program that requires a lot of education and a lot of build-up from the society point of view. He was talking about finding role models. I mean, I would challenge the principle of role models in the case of Syria, because in the case of Syria, in the case of many, I guess, Oriental countries, the role models are quite often disturbed by certain pre-imposed principles and characteristics. The other issue of changing the education system, and I mean all this, Dr. Sami, is quite interesting. But if we want to reach decentralization this way, it will never happen that fast, especially when we are in a post-conflict environment. There will be huge demand from the local level, and the central authorities will not be able to cater this demand. And probably it will not have the legitimacy even, or it will have a disputed legitimacy to start with. So how we will maintain this balance of decentralization and centralization? Sometimes the recipe of decentralization, and here I'm playing the devil advocate with you a little bit, the recipe of the decentralization could be a perfect recipe for a total destruction of a certain nationalistic entity, unless you have a legitimate central power that can tie it all together. Sorry, I was long, and these are more than comments than questions, actually.
It's input, actually. Okay, just please, because I can see new faces that I didn't see yesterday. Please, anyone who wants to ask, please, if he can just introduce himself.
So
Sorry.
My name is Bassel Kagadou. I work for the United Nations National Agenda for the Future of Syria.
Okay. Yeah.
مرحبا، يعطيكم العافية جميعا. رح أحكي بالعربي، معلش. بدي أسأل دكتور خيمي عن الاقتصاد، إذا بده يصير لا مركزي، هل رح يرضوا أمراء الحرب بذلك؟ هل أصلا نحن عنا خيارات، ولا هذا الشيء رح يكون مفروض فرض من قبل القوة اللي رح تسيطر بعد الحرب؟ هل رح يرضوا انه يتقاسموا ارباحهم معنا كشعب؟ وبتعتقد هذا الشيء عائق ولا لا؟ الشغله الثانيه، يمكن ما بعرف اذا فهمت صح، قلت شيء له علاقه بالتساهل بالعداله الانتقاليه او بالعداله عموما لحتى تقدر تصير في مصالحه. انا برايي من خلال تجربتي، انا بشتغل مسرح تفاعلي مع الناس بالعموم، اعتقد انه مستحيل تصير مصالحة مش اتفاقيات استسلام أو شيء من دون ما يكون في عدالة. يعني هذا واضح من كيف بتحكي العالم. بدي أسأل دكتورة إنيس وإما، حسب تعريفك للمصالحة، مش التعريف اللي أنتم مقترحينه، لا تبدو أنها مصالحة أبدا. يعني إذا بنشيل كلمة مصالحة ونحط استسلام تزبط، ما بدها. فبناء على ذلك، أول شيء، هل تنص الاتفاقيات يلي عم بتصير على عدم عودة هذول المهجرين بشكل واضح؟ يعني هل هذا نص واضح في الاتفاقيات؟ وليش عم ترضى العالم تطلع فعلا؟ يعني ليش ما عم هلا حكت إما شوي عن المخاوف الأمنية يلي كلياتنا بنعرفها إنه أكيد رح يصير، بس إنه هل هن عم يرضوا يطلعوا بسبب إغراءات أخرى، ولا بسبب إثني مثل ما قال أستاذ كغدو، ولا يعني السؤال الرئيسي بالنسبة لي أنه هل النظام السوري أو القوى المتنازعة النظام بالمعنى السلطة المعارضة أو السلطة السياسية بسوريا هل يريدون مصالحة فعلا؟ ولا هي المصالحة مجرد حجة لحتى لأنه أنا بتخيل أنه هي فرصتهم الرئيسية لحتى يضلوا عم يستفيدوا ويضلوا وشكرا كتير. بس ضل آخر شغلة معلش، تسمية المصالحة تحديدا يلي هي بتخيل النظام هو اللي أول حدا حكى بشيء اسمه مصالحة، واللي شايفين كتير نحن أنه هي مش مصالحات، هي عم تكون اتفاقيات الناس بين بعضها ما عم تتصالح. فهل هو فخ وقعنا فيه كمان؟ هل لازم نغير المصطلح؟ وشكرا.
Thank you. One more questions, then we can. Darin, please. Okay, you can. Okay.
يعطيكم العافية. سؤال للسيد الخيامي. خلينا نبلش بالبداية. بلشت المداخلة بالمطالبة بدولة القانون وسيادة القانون وتطبيقه ودولة المواطنة، بس في مثل تغييب مين بده يعمل دولة المواطنة، مين بده يطبق سيادة القانون. هل نحن عم نحكي عن نفس النظام اللي لعقود ويوميا كان ينتهك تطبيق سيادة القانون، أم نحن أم أنه أنت بتعني شيء تاني بهذا الموضوع؟ بالنسبة لموضوع المصالحات، في شيء جديد فيما يتعلق بمخيم اليرموك، ممكن أن تكون سابقة، ما بعرف مدى صحتها، بس في حكي على أنه المصالحات اللي صارت بمخيم اليرموك مع الروس فيها ورقة يجب أن يوقع عليها المغادرين لمخيم اليرموك، وهي إسقاط حقهم في العودة. ما بعرف قديش صحيحة هاي المعلومات، وما بعرف مدى أو شمولية انطباقها، هل تنطبق على المقاتلين وعلى المدنيين، وهل تنطبق على الفلسطينيين والسوريين الموجودين بالمخيم؟ ما في تأكيد للموضوع، لكن هذا عم ينحكى فيه وعم ينحكى فيه بأوساط المعارضة، بس ما عندنا المعلومات بعد الكافية لهيك. في شيء بين إيديكم بهذا الموضوع؟ شكرا.
Let's take first set of questions. Who wants to start? Dr. Sami?
Yes. Mr. Basil first. The question of role model is essential. It is, there is no doubt that there is an exaggeration in the role model. John Wayne was an American role model at a certain period of time. Everybody was looking at the successful American over-resource, winning against the Red Indians, etc. Nobody thought at that time whether he has taken a shower or how many times he takes a shower a day. He must be stinking a lot, but it doesn't matter. He's a role model. The same, maybe James Stewart, 20 years later, represented the good American father, nice man, family man, etc. Today, it is maybe Mr. Trump, I don't know, to a certain extent. So it doesn't matter who is the role model, but there should be a role model. Syrians have to identify themselves with the role model. The Bedouin or tribal man can see in the generous side of the role model. He is so proud to be generous. So every Syrian would be proud to be generous. This is why I think that the role model helps the society to unite. If you see a Syrian drama series, they seem all the time to be cooking. So this means that the cuisine and doing good cuisine is an important side of the Syrian personality. So we have to stress that in the role model. So a chef has some of the role model criteria. Now, about decentralization, you are right. It'll take time. There is no doubt that we have to do it in a very gradual manner. The biggest problem is most probably the absence of competencies in the regions. And there may be some administrative know-how, and there may be many lawyers. By the way, the democracy of education in Syria was generated, whether it was intentional or not, I think it was a bit intentional, generated a sort of distribution of at least human competences. Technical competences tended to go to the big cities to work. Otherwise, you would find, for example, in a village near Kamishli, something like somebody told me we have 40 lawyers. Can you imagine? When they look across the border, the Turkish border, and they look at a small town that resembles their town, it has only one lawyer, sometimes two. But in the Syrian one, they have 40 lawyers. So these are positive things that we should not keep away. Whether it will weaken the central authority, what I propose here is the contrary. I didn't talk about decentralization as such. I talked about economic decentralization, which means decentralization of investments. It means that you authorize the local council to take decisions about the investments. So everything that would contribute to the prosperity of the locality is welcome in economic decentralization. Everything that has to do with splitting up or sharing the natural resources is not welcome. Everything that has to do with sharing the army or the whatever, dislocating the country, causing a dislocation of the country is not welcome. Now, about العدالة ممكن أقلب بالعربي حول العدالة الحقيقة أنه جربت العدالة القاسمة الحاسمة في كثير من الحروب التي جرت في العالم وأثبتت أنه لا تؤدي إلى نتيجة بل تؤدي إلى تهشيم المجتمع أكثر. بتتذكروا بفترة لحسن الحظ مثلا في فرنسا عندما احتلت كان في مجموعة كبيرة من الناس الكولابوراتور والكولابوراتور تسلى الفرنسيون مدة من الزمان في اتهام بعضهم لقد كان يخدم الألمان يأخذوا يعفتوا بل لحسن الحظ ما عدموا بس نحن في وضعنا بسبب الحساسيات العديدة والتهم العديدة إذا انتقلنا إلى قضية العدالة الانتقامية لذلك هون اقترحت أن يتم حصر العدالة في الجرائم الشخصية التي يعني يقصد بها شخص قتل شخص بعينه وحصرها بجرائم ضد الإنسانية وإلا إذا فتحت على مصراعي مشكلة. هل سيجبروننا أو القوى التي تملك نفوذا على اتخاذ قرارات وليس لنا كلام؟ أنا دائما أقول بالعودة إلى المجتمع وليس العودة إلى الحكومة والمعارضة. الحكومة والمعارضة برأيي تمثل من ناحية الرأي العام 2 سوا 20 ل 30% من الرأي العام. الحقيقة المجتمع ليس صامت، المجتمع موجود ولكن يجب إحياؤه ودعمه لكي يتخذ قراراته. هذا المجتمع أنا متأكد أنه لن يقبل بأي شيء إذعان. هل المصالحة إذعان أم مصالحة؟ أنا بعتقد أن المصالحة الحقيقية التي نتكلم عنها والمرتبطة بالاقتصاد وتحسن ظروف المعيشة تخفف من الرغبة أيضا في الانتقام. انتبه انه واحد يكون في مليون ليرة وراء مليون على القديم، يعني مليون ليرة وراء خايف عليه هون، يعني ما له كتير مصلحة انه يتقاتل مع جاره.
Okay, شكرا دكتور سامي. Emma, would you want to?
So there was a couple there. Are people returning to these areas? Yes and no. And it depends on each location specifically, and it is generally done by permission. Obviously, people have their own security concerns that they weigh up themselves, and then they have to go through a process to understand if they can go back to these reconciled areas, and that is a security services issue, which is a problem. And I guess you're right, the reconciliation in this sense is not reconciliation in the sense of what reconciliation means. Is it another trap? Kind of, yes. And I think the adoption of the semantics around it is part of that. And in terms of it serves two purposes. So for the government, it allows them to essentially consolidate back a majority of the country and be able to participate in conversations about settlements from a position of power, from the international community point of view. At this point, I think a cynical read would be that they are exhausted, and anything that reduces violence and allows some pathway forward is something that they will participate in regardless of the problems with it. And that leads us to the bigger issue, which is that the irreconcilables have all been moved to Idlib, or they have left. And so when the question of do they want to reconcile, at that level, the answer is no. And so politically, we're seeing that play out with a complete stalling of the peace process. And militarily, we'll see that play out in the north, with whatever it is that will happen there, is the short answer.
اوكي. استاذ باسل، انا بالعربي اوكي. انا متفقه معك انه في رابط بين يعني انه اكثريه السكان موجودين بيد المناطق انه من اصل سنه، بس انه كمان بدي اقول انه باستثناء بعض المناطق مثل الدرايا وزبداني وكابون، انه بالمناطق الثانيه انه في ناس باقيين كمان بنفس الوقت وان السنه كمان. السؤال انه وانا بفكر انه النظام انه سيكون بحاجه انه اعاده بناء علاقات مع هذه المجموعات. بهذا السبب عم بقول انه القصد انه نشيل كل شيء انه في معارضه او كل شيء كان تحديات للنظام خلال السنوات الماضيه، بس انا متاكده انه كمان في رابط، يعني فينا بنرجع للارقام وهيك، بس انه انا معك. حاليا انه ما عندنا اثبات على انه في مجموعات شيعة من العراق او من لبنان او من ايران انه اجوا، حتى اذا في بعض العائلات المقاتلين الشيعة اجوا بهذه المناطق، ما بكير عشان نعرف اذا مؤكد او لا كمان. لازم نكون كثير حذرين على هذا الموضوع. الجواب انا يعني متفقه معك كمان 100%. قلت في البدايه انه المصطلحات اجا من الميديا تبع النظام اكثر شيء، وشيء رسمي باسم وزاره المصطلحات. عم فضل انه بنحكي عن اتفاقات محليه بحته بدون مصطلحات. سألت كمان ليش انه الناس يعني في عودة اليوم أو لا بعض الاتفاقات. أنا برأيي إنه مثل ما إيما قلت إنه حسب وين كمان وين صار إنه بالمدن وين صار التوتال ايفيكشن ده رأيي إنه بعد ما في أكيد. بس إنه بنعرف إنه شو الأسباب الرئيسية إنه ليش الناس ما بيرجعون. أول شيء مثل ما قلت إنه التجنيد الإجباري للشباب هذا شيء كتير مهم بهذا المناطق بس كمان مناطق تانية. تاني شيء إنه إذا بنرجع عن إنه شو عم بيعمل الحكومة بهذا المناطق. أصلاً إنه بيشتغل عشان تقليل شبكات الكهرباء والماء بس ما في أي جهود عشان تأهيل البيوت. هذا كمان مشكلة كبيرة بس أنا برأيي إنه المشكلة الأكبر هو أمني وإنه يعني ما في أي ضمانات وما في أي ضمانات لحماية المدنيين عشان العودة لحلها. وكان في سؤال تاني لا أنا اليرموك ما بعرف إنه ما سمعت إنه في بند أو بنود إنه لازم يوقعوا عشان لا عودة بس إنه إذا بنرجع نشوف الاتفاقات المحلية إنه في مثال واحد وين صار احتمال تبادل السكان على أساس السكترين يعني على أساس الاتجاه. كان الاتفاق المدن الأربعة وكان بهذه الفترة إنه زبدني وبنايا بمقابل فوعة وكفرايا وبهذه الفترة إنه صار خفض من هالي فوعة وكفرايا وحلا إنه باليرموك بمفاوضات يرموك إنه عم نرجع عن هذا السيناريو. شكرا.
Due the time, just allow me to take more couple or three of questions. Dareen, please.
Thank you all for your presentations. I have two questions, one for Dr. Sami. I see your point. I understand what you're trying to advocate for in terms of economic decentralization in the peripheries while preserving the central state. I just think there is a number of problems with this premise. One is the assumption that there was a functioning central state that reached these areas to begin with, which was never the case prior to the revolution, let alone after the fall of the government in these areas. If you look at, I would say 50% of the country, all the north of Syria, whether northwest or northeast, you have an extreme form of economic decentralization. You have trade cross-border, cross fault lines. It's ongoing, it's happening. I just don't see how that could in any chance lead to any reconciliation. I can only see, at least in the last 7 years, that what was happening is that this form of economic decentralization has been empowering those in charge of these local hubs of power. And as one of the participants said, the warlords, as they describe them, even if they're not warlords, it is empowering the local entities in these areas. But it is not at all leading to reconciliation. That's one. Two, you're also assuming that the premise that people went, well, the revolution and then the war happened for economic purposes, which really was not. I mean, if you go to these areas, you're going to realize that the state, whether in its political or economic form, is not visible nor present, never was. And people are already like functioning and operating to fill that vacuum. So you have currently in Syria 4 governments. So when you say preserving a government or preserving a state, you have 4 functioning states already. So the assumption that there is a central state capable or willing or able, I think, is a false premise, and it is leading to consequences that are not realistic in one sense. So I'm sorry, it's not a question, it's just a comment. My question to Emma and Agnes is, I think local reconciliations, the way we've seen it in the last few years in terms of siege, starvation, displacement, might not be the way forward to the regime, only because there are no remaining hubs of opposition that they're capable of doing that with. But what we've been seeing recently, and I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on, is local reconciliation sponsored by Russia specifically through committees in the Northeast. I was just in Manbij, and I've seen that 700 people, including their families, have resettled their cases with the regime, meaning they go back to state salaries, and they're put on the reserve list for the military. They remain to live outside of regime-held areas, but they're basically focal points to the regime at this point. So do you see that as a positive or negative development, and do you see a way forward in terms of scaling that up, or basically taking that to a reconciliation format in a way? So for people to not be displaced, not necessarily have to live in regime-held areas, but to go, basically the return of a state, as a state institution, become part of their salaries, take salaries, but not have to play a role. Thank you.
Kirsten?
Thank you. Kirsten Ainley from the London School of Economics. Thank you for your fascinating presentations. I have a question that's prompted by Dr. Sami's remark that minimal accountability is needed. So I'm not sure that that's what the evidence suggests is successful in other cases. The World Bank and the UNDP have just done a large study around the durability of peace, and they found that high-level prosecutions can destabilize peace. Well, they may be a good idea anyway, and they may be something that we would want to do on principle, but that the prosecution of lower-level offenders and constitutional reform processes are actually correlated with more stable peace over long periods of time. So really just to throw out the idea that we don't know yet, I think, which accountability measures do lead to reconciliation and stability. And what the new evidence is showing is it may be that accountability processes that reach deeper are the ones that lead to stability, and the ones that are taking out higher level, the commanders who are responsible for crimes against humanity, which I think most people agree in Syria is a necessary accountability process. Actually, that's probably going to be a destabilizing process rather than one that leads to peace. But as I say, there may be very good reasons to do it anyway. So I guess the question to all of the panelists in the light of that, and you may disagree, you may think the evidence does show that that accountability should be limited to the high level. But the question to the panelists is there room for local support for accountability mechanisms? And what should the role of international actors be in this? Should they largely leave local accountability efforts alone, or should they support them? What should the internationals, who of course can be very distortionary in the way that their funding then leads to different efforts being focused on, what should the role of internationals be if there are local initiatives towards some form of accountability, which may of course not be criminal accountability. There may be different forms of accountability processes that can take place locally. Thank you very much.
Thank you. One more questions? Anyone? Here, please. Just
شكرا للمداخلين.
Briefly, please.
اوكي. أنا بدي أكد أول شيء على ضرورة الاتفاق على أنه هذا المصطلح ما نكرسه طالما كلمة مصالحة صدرت من جهة واحدة. أنيس اقترحت من شوي أنه نسميها اتفاقات محلية. أنا وجهة نظري بشوفها هي استمرار لسلسلة من انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان اللي مستمرة على نطاق واسع من 7 سنوات. المصالحة دون جبر ضرر وبالحد الأدنى من المساءلة هو التصور مسبق، هو افتراض مسبق ما بيشارك أصحاب العلاقة، هو تصور مسبق بيسقط الانطلاق من العدالة كقيمة أولية، هو مانو البديل لعدالة قاسمة. العدالة القاسمة أو الانتقامية هي مثل العدالة بالحد الأدنى من المساءلة، هي مفروضة فرض وهي تصور فوقي، هي ما بتدخل أصحاب الشأن باختيار مسار العدالة. الأهم من هيك هذا التجزيء هو تماما اللي عمله النظام مع التدخل الروسي، التعامل مع كل منطقة بمنطقتها كأنها هي حالة فردية، ما هي حالة على المستوى الوطني في مشكلة. الحصار هو جريمة حرب، التهجير هو جريمة حرب، إذا سميناها مصالحة ما بيتغير طبيعتها، قد ترقى عفوا لأن تكون جريمة حرب، هذا ممكن يتم إثباته لاحقا. هذا التجزيء بيسقط المساءلة على اللي فكر وعلى اللي خطط وعلى عطى الأمر، وبيكتفي بمحاسبة من أطلق الرصاصة الأخيرة. شكرا.
اوكي دكتور سامي.
الحقيقة طرحت عدة أشياء، أنا بدي أركز على بعض الأشياء. أولا ابني، المشكلة في هذا العالم أنه لا توجد هناك عدالة أممية، يعني العالم عالم ظالم بطبيعته، القوي يقتل الضعيف. لما بتجي أنت بعد حرب كبيرة في بلد ما بتعرف تعرف مين بدك تحاسب. هل يا ترى الشاب اللي أخذ على الخدمة العسكرية وأوص ومات، اللي قتله هل تحاسب اللي قتله، ولا بتقول لا هذاك عم بيحارب من أجل العدل وحماية الشعب السوري معلش يقتلوه؟ أم هل تحاسب الجندي الذي قتل؟ أصلا معظم جنودنا الكرام عم بيقوصوا بالمدافع، يعني ما لهم شايفين ولا بيعرفوا أصلا وين بدها تنزل الأنبياء. لذلك هناك يعني وصف أعمى للمدنيين، وبالتالي هناك ضحايا كثر نتجوا عن قلة خبرة حتى في الحرب من الجهتين على فكرة، لأنه اثنين مبدعين بنفس نوع التدريب، ولذلك يا رب تقف عينهم شغالة. فأنت لما بدك تعمل عدالة في شيء اسمه intentional killing، يعني قصد هذا الرجل بالقتل أو هذه المرأة بالقتل، وهناك جريمة ضد الإنسانية عندما يتعلق القتل بمجموعة كبيرة من الناس، هذه بتقدر تطبق عليها عدالة مثل ما ساووا برواندا وبوروندي وإلى آخره. أما أنك تطبق العدالة في كل شغلة فربما ستؤجل وتؤزم الوضع الاجتماعي الانشقاقي. هي نقطة دائما خليك عم تفكر فيها. المصالحة أم إذعان؟ معك حق. إذا أعدت للمجتمع الحق في القرار فهو سيخلق مصالحة. أما إذا بقيت من غالب ومن مغلوب غصبا عن راسكم فهذه ليست مصالحة، لكن وجود الأجنبي أحيانا يحسن من شروط المصالحة على فكرة، أو ما سمي بالمصالحة. يعني أنا هذيك من يومين إجاني تفاصيل الاتفاق بين الروس وبين جماعة الرسام في كثير من البنود، يعني لا بأس بها. نحن لا يجب أن ننسى أن كثير من الذين يغادرون هم من لا يملكون مهنة لكي يبقوا، يعني تعودوا يحمل البارودة وصار زلمة بالبارودة، فشو بده يعمل هذا؟ لا بيعرف يطبخ ولا بيعرف يمسح ولا بيعرف يكنس ولا بيعرف يعمل حدادة ولا نجارة ولا إلكترونيك ولا بيشتغل بالكمبيوتر. شو بده يعمل؟ بيحمل بارودته بيروح لإدلب أو بيعمل بارودته بيقول جراد. أما الحداد والنجار وإلى آخره فهذا عادة بيعمل ما يسمى اليوم تسويق. فهذه المسائل يعني وجود الروس، طبعا لو كانوا اسكندناف كان أحسن، بس هذا اللي عنا. وجود الروس أرحم من وجود جهة أخرى. حول الانترناشنال، دور الانترناشنال في اللوكال سبورت اوف كورس. أوروبا حتى الآن Europe and the West in general have been acting as if الجامع مسكر ونحن مستريحين. The mosque is closed and we are happy, so no need to help. But basically, every local region that has a feasible project to support should be supported. Yani, this would help and shorten the period of gradual economic decentralization. By really, somebody who wants to generate energy from solar panels, and he creates a project, inshallah, in Hasaka, inshallah, in Jarablus, inshallah, anywhere in Syria, to produce some electricity. What is keeping the West from supporting such a good project to help this man or woman to create his business and generate electricity from solar cells? فهذه this excuse not to contribute because the government is not doing the right thing is not a reason. I think this is الجامع مسكر ونحن مستريحين, and this is very important to change this policy. A policy of general sanctions over the whole country is really because of the disregard to the Syrian people. One of the biggest problems that Syria is facing is non-inclusivity. We are not included in the world community, in the respectable world community. احنا يلا خليهم يقتلوا بعض. Let them kill themselves. The absence of inclusivity is the main problem. Otherwise, the Syrian problem would have been solved long time ago by the world community.
Thank you so much.
So the point about Manbij, and I think that that models a little more what I think the Russians' concept of this reconciliation process is, because if you look at the way that they report reconciliation, they don't say 42 towns, they say 7,000 reconciliations. So their understanding of the process that they are conducting is very different than the one that we were just speaking about, and what you're saying kind of matches that. So we've seen a huge increase recently in these Russian so-called reconciliations, or whatever they are, in southern Syria. And I think it's about sort of building allies, or building people that are on board to then flip the area later. And I think that in that sense, this is the problem with the conversation about decentralization and a cross-line governance sort of idea, because the government isn't going to have that. They're not paying those people's salaries out of the goodness of their hearts, so that they can stay up there and leave them alone. There is a strategy that will get them what they want in the end, or that their aim will be to get what they want in the end. Similarly, I think in the South, we'll see that those allies used in a way over the coming months for an agenda. And I think with regard to accountability, the more immediate problem is these issues that are continuing to bank and undermine and store up problems of accountability. So if you think about, there's some studies that have been done talking to people about what sort of accountability would they want to see. And a lot of people do say, well, I'm kind of okay with not that much, to be honest. Like, if we can all just sort of try to get along, that would be nice. But at the moment, there are things happening that are making that worse. So if you think about individual people as self-interested actors, being displaced from your home or being unable to return to your town are bigger issues to me than structural problems or something that happened, in a war crime in another part of the country. So the things that we are seeing through this process of displacement and the process of this huge planning agenda, which I guess people will talk about later today, that is going to ensure the permanent displacement of so many people, those issues are actually building up this problem of accountability more and more and more. So when you think about what international actors could be doing, the problem is, the answer is probably just, like anything would be good. And I don't mean in terms of like transitional justice tribunals for these crimes. I mean in terms of there is currently a peace process that is completely stalled. And even the framework that is currently in place is basically like, how do we get through this with the least drama and something that approximates something we can all go home from, isn't actually going to address any of these problems. So some of this needs to be written into the Constitution if you're using the Constitution drafting process essentially as your framework for a peace agreement. But nobody is saying actually, you know, detainees only had the first meeting on detainees in Astana in March. And HLP only just made its way into the Geneva envoys like radar in the last month or two. And these are huge spoilers, like in accountability terms long term. So actually looking at what those ones that are still in play are before we go back and adjudicate things that have already happened or debate the terms of what that would be is so important, and getting them into the process now is important, because the current process is, after it is finished, is too late to raise those, you know what I mean? So yeah, the answer is that like anything would be nice.
Thank you so much. Actually, would you have any comments?
No, it's okay.
It's okay? Okay. Thank you so much. Actually, we have no more time because we have another panel, so please join me thanking the fascinating panel. Thank you so much. Thank you.